The wind in the Eidolon Reach did not blow. It hummed. It was a low, resonant vibration that traveled through the soles of boots, rather than against the skin, a constant reminder that the ground beneath was less a foundation and more a suggestion. Here, along the ragged edge of the frontier, gravity was a temperamental landlord, occasionally deciding to evict the rocks, the sand, and anyone foolish enough not to bolt themselves down. Luther adjusted the strap of his goggles, squinting against the abrasive glare of the dual suns filtering through the atmospheric dust. The dust did not settle here. Millions of particles of silica and heavy metals hung suspended in the air, at waist height, forming a shimmering golden ocean that undulated with invisible tides. He was perched on an outcropping of basalt that jutted over a drop of 3,000 feet. Below him, the canyon floor was a mess of floating islands and erratic magnetic currents. He was tired. It was a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the climb and everything to do with the 20 years of combat engineering he had left behind in the core systems. He had come to the Reach to be a ghost, to fix broken machinery that did not ask him about the war, and to sleep without dreaming of orbital bombardments. Spectral variance at 4%, Luther muttered to the sensor unit he was calibrating. The machine, a battered piece of surplus hardware, chirped a dismal protest. "Don't argue with me. You are misaligned." He tapped the casing with a wrench. It was a percussive maintenance technique that was not in the manual, but had a 100% success rate in the field. The sensor hummed a compliant blue tone. Then the light changed. It was subtle at first. The golden hue of the suspended dust shifted, darkening to the color of a bruised plum. The hairs on Luther's arms stood up, pushing against the fabric of his flight suit. The hum in the rock grew louder, shifting from a background vibration to a distinct rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a heartbeat, a massive geological heartbeat. Luther froze. He looked up at the horizon. The aurora, usually a distant curtain of green and white, had snapped down from the upper atmosphere. It was bleeding violet now, swirling in violent, impossible knots. "Echo tide," Luther whispered. "It is not due for another 6 days." He scrambled to pack his gear. An echo tide was not just a storm. It was a psychomorphic event. The gravity waves scrambled the electrochemical signals in the brain. If you were caught in the open without shielding, you didn't just get blown away. You forgot who you were, or worse, you remembered things that had never happened to you. He snapped the latches on his toolkit and turned toward the safety of the ridgeline. That was when he saw the runner. She was moving across the shattered spine, a natural bridge of floating slate shards that connected his outpost to the northern plateau, with a speed that made Luther blink. She was Cathari, towering at nearly 7 feet, her silhouette long and lean against the violent purple sky. Her skin was the color of deep space, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, but she was illuminated by the bioluminescent rings on her long, muscular tail, which acted as a counterbalance as she leapt from one floating rock to another. She was not running away from the storm. She was running into it. Luther paused, his instinct to survive, warring with the ingrained idiotic reflex of a veteran who could not watch a civilian get themselves killed. "Hey!" he shouted, though the rising wind stole the sound from his throat. The Cathari woman did not look at him. Her focus was absolute. She was tracking something, a faint, rhythmic pulse of blue light that moved along the ridge, distinct from the chaotic violet of the storm. Then, the gravity buckled. It was a phenomenon the locals called a shear. The gravitational constant in the canyon inverted for a microsecond. The bridge of slate shards the woman was sprinting across groaned. The physics holding the stones together simply stopped working. With a sound like a cracking whip, the bridge shattered. The Cathari woman had anticipated the sway, but she had not anticipated the disintegration. The stone beneath her boots turned to dust. She plummeted. Luther did not think. He did not weigh the pros and cons of involvement. He dropped his toolkit and threw himself flat against the edge of the basalt outcrop, reaching out over the abyss. "Grab on!" he roared. She was falling past him, her eyes wide, glowing with a fierce amber luminescence. She reached out her fingers, brushing his butt. The gravity shear yanked her down faster than human reflexes could counter. Her hand slipped through his. She fell. But the Cathari anatomy was built for the verticality of the reach. As she tumbled, her long, prehensile tail lashed out in a desperate reflex, seeking purchase. It whipped through the air with the sound of a cable under tension. Luther saw the arc of bioluminescent light. He lunged further, risking his own balance, and clamped his hands around the only part of her he could reach. He caught her by the tail. The moment his skin made contact with the glowing rings near the tip of her tail, a shockwave slammed into Luther's skull. It was not an electric shock. It was a neural feedback loop. For a split second, he tasted the color blue and heard the smell of ozone. He felt a surge of raw indignity and panic that was not his own. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his shoulders screaming, as her full weight snapped the line of his arm taut. He dug his boots into the cracks of the rock. "I have got you," he gritted out, his voice strained. "Do not let go." The woman swung below him, 3,000 feet of nothingness beneath her boots. She looked up, her expression a chaotic mix of relief and absolute blinding fury. She curled her body upward, using the core strength that her species was famous for, and grabbed the ledge with her hands. With a heave that nearly dislocated Luther's shoulder, he hauled her up and over the rim. They collapsed onto the flat stone, gasping for air, as the echo tide roared overhead, turning the sky into a kaleidoscope of bruising colors. Luther rolled onto his back, his chest heaving. His hands tingled with a phantom numbness, where he had gripped the bioluminescent rings. He looked over at her. She was terrifyingly beautiful, in the way a thunderstorm or a predatory cat was beautiful. Her armor was light, articulated ceramic plates that shifted with her movement, but her helmet was off, revealing sharp aristocratic features and ears that tapered to delicate points, currently flushed a deep, iridescent purple. She sat up, dusting off the silica with sharp, angry motions. Then she turned her gaze on him. Her eyes were narrowing. "You," she hissed. Her voice had a harmonic quality, like two people speaking in unison. "You touched my tail." Luther blinked, sitting up slowly. He wiped a smear of blood from his cheek, where a pebble had grazed him. "You are welcome," he said, his voice dry. "You grabbed it," she accused, standing up. She towered over him, her tail twitching behind her, like an agitated snake. The rings where he had touched her were pulsing with a rapid, erratic light. "With your bare hands, without a conduit glove." "I left my formal gloves in my other pants," Luther said, getting to his feet and checking his knees for broken bones. "Next time I will let you fall 3,000 feet. That seems more polite." "There is no next time," she snapped. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his battered flight suit and the gray at his temples. "You are human, a transient worker." "Retired," Luther corrected. "And I just saved your life." Usually people say, "Thank you," before they start critiquing the technique. "I did not need saving," she lied. It was a blatant, prideful lie. "I had the trajectory calculated." "You were falling into a gravity well," Luther pointed out, gesturing to the abyss. "Unless you can fly, your calculation ended as a stain on the canyon floor." She opened her mouth to retort, but a sudden pulse of sound cut through the roar of the wind. It was a dissonant chord, sharp and mechanical, completely at odds with the natural hum of the tide. Isolde Luther did not know her name yet, but he categorized her instantly as trouble. Spun around her aggression, vanishing into cold focus. She dropped to a crouch, examining a slab of rock near the edge where the bridge had snapped. Luther moved closer, curiosity overriding his desire to leave. Embedded in the rock was a small black device. It was shaped like a tuning fork, but made of a material that seemed to absorb the violet light of the storm. Etched into its surface were symbols that looked like musical notation. "What is that?" Luther asked. "Do not look at it," she ordered, but it was too late. The device pulsed. It wasn't a sound. It was a broadcast. Luther felt the world tilt. Suddenly, he was not on the cliff. He was back in the trenches of Cinder Prime. The smell of burning ozone filled his nose. He heard the scream of incoming artillery. He saw the face of his squad leader, a man who had been dead for 15 years, shouting an order he couldn't hear. "Hold the line, Luther! Just hold the line!" Then, just as quickly, the vision snapped. Luther staggered back, his hand flying to his temple. He was nauseous. The echo tide was supposed to cause memory confusion, but this was different. This was precise. It was a weaponized hallucination. "That's," Luther gasped, shaking his head to clear the phantom smoke from his eyes. "That's military grade. But not any military I know." Isolde smashed the device with the hilt of her blade. The pulsing stopped. She looked at him, surprised. "You resisted the dissonance. A human mind usually breaks under that frequency." "My mind has been broken plenty of times," Luther muttered, straightening up. "It is built of scar tissue. Takes a lot to get through." She looked at him, then really looked at him, not as a nuisance but as a puzzle. "Who are you?" "Luther," he said. "Just Luther, and you should not be out here. The tide is peaking early." "It is not early," she said grimly. "It is being summoned." Before Luther could ask what she meant, the sound of engines roared over the ridge. A skiff painted in the obsidian and silver colors of the Cathari High Guard crested the cliff and slammed down onto the rock, its gravity drives whining in protest against the storm. A ramp descended, and a squad of Cathari soldiers poured out. They moved with fluid, lethal grace, weapons raised. Leading them was a Cathari male, who was even larger than the woman. His armor was heavy, decorated with the crest of a stormhawk. This was Orin. Orin scanned the scene instantly. He saw the broken bridge. He saw the smashed device. And then, his eyes locked on Isolde's tail. The rings where Luther had grabbed her were still glowing a frantic, pulsating red gold, distinct from the calm blue of the rest of her markings. It was a biological tell, a lingering mark of contact. Orin's face went rigid. He looked at Luther with a mixture of disbelief and homicidal intent. "Isolde," Orin rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "He touched you. He saved me, Orin," Isolde said, stepping between the giant and Luther. Her voice was sharp, commanding. The bridge collapsed. It was a shearing event. "He touched the oath rings," Orin said, ignoring her explanation. He leveled his weapon, a heavy kinetic repeater, at Luther's chest. "Human, do you have any idea what you have done?" Luther held up his hands, palms open. "I pulled her up. That is the extent of my crime. If there is a fine for unauthorized handling of local nobility, send me the bill." "A fine," Orin repeated, seemingly choking on the word. "He thinks there is a fine." "Stand down, Orin," Isolde ordered. "That is a direct command from the air scout." Orin hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger. "He has compromised your resonance, my lady. Look at the flare. He grabbed you with intent." "His intent was that I not die," Isolde snapped. "Secure the area. There is null choir technology here. They are weaponizing the tide." She turned back to Luther. Her expression was unreadable now, the anger replaced by a strange, stiff formality. "You will come with us." "I have a sensor to fix," Luther said, pointing to his toolkit. "And I really prefer to stay out of local politics." "You are already in it," Isolde said. "The moment your skin touched mine, you became part of the equation. If we leave you here, the tide will scour your mind clean within the hour. And," she paused, glancing at his hands, "you have been exposed to the neural feedback of a Cathari royal. You will lose consciousness in approximately 30 seconds. "I feel fine," Luther said. Then he took a step and realized the ground was made of rubber. The edges of his vision began to blur into white static. Okay, maybe 20 seconds. Dr. Mira will want to see this, Isolde said to Oren. Load him onto the skiff. Do not damage him. Can I damage him a little bit? Oren grumbled, lowering his weapon, but looking disappointed. No, Isolde said. Luther felt his knees give way. The last thing he saw before the world faded to black was Isolde's face, looking down at him with a complex expression, guilt, curiosity, and something that looked terrifyingly like obligation. Just my luck, Luther mumbled as the darkness took him. I save the Queen and I get arrested. Consciousness returned to Luther, not as a flood, but as a slow, rhythmic dripping. Drip, drip, drip. He smelled antiseptic, but not the sharp chemical smell of human hospitals. This smelled like crushed mint and wet ozone. The air was cool and humid. He opened his eyes. Above him was not the sky, but a ceiling of carved bioluminescent stone. Veins of natural light ran through the rock, pulsing gently, like the interior of a living thing. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His head throbbed as if someone had used it to break open a crate of ammunition. Lie down, hero, a voice said. It was sharp female and speaking common with a distinct Earth accent. Luther turned his head. Standing by a console of transparent crystal monitors was a human woman. She was short with messy auburn hair, tied back in a chopstick, wearing a white lab coat over practical cargo pants. This was Dr. Mira. She was looking at a holographic display of his vitals, shaking her head. Where am I? Luther croaked. The Spire of Whispers, Mira said, not looking up. Central stronghold of the Cathari. You have been out for 12 hours. You are lucky your nervous system didn't fuse. Human nerves aren't designed to interface with Cathari bioelectric fields. Luther rubbed his face. I grabbed her tail. I didn't interface with anything. Mira turned to him, then leaning against the console with a smirk that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. Oh, you interfaced, Luther. You interfaced hard. Do you know what the tail is for a Cathari? It's not just for balance. It's a bundle of exposed neural pathways. It's how they sense gravity, emotion, and resonance. Touching the rings on a female's tail is intimate. I was saving her life, Luther defended himself. I know, Mira sighed. And that is the only reason Oren hasn't thrown you off the balcony. But intention doesn't change biology, and it certainly doesn't change the law. Law. Luther sat up, ignoring the spinning of the room. What law? I am a foreigner. I have diplomatic immunity or something, don't I? You are on the frontier, Luther. There is no diplomacy here. Only gravity and tradition. Mira walked over and shone a penlight into his eyes. Pupils are responsive. Synaptic lag is minimal. You are tough for an old war dog. I am 42, Luther grumbled. That is not old. In this sector it is ancient, Mira said. She clicked off the light. Look, I will be straight with you. You walked into a mess. Isolde is not just a scout. She is the heir, the daughter of the patriarch. And the Null Choir, those fanatics she was chasing, they are making moves we haven't seen in decades. I saw the device, Luther said, his voice dropping. It made me remember things. Things I have tried very hard to forget. Mira's expression darkened. Cognitive dissonance weaponization. We suspected they had it. If they can control the echo tide. She trailed off. That is a problem for the Council. Your problem is more immediate. What is my problem? Before Mira could answer, the heavy stone doors at the end of the room groaned open. The man who entered sucked the air out of the room. He was massive even for a Cathari. His skin was the color of a moonless void, and his robes were woven from threads of silver and starlight. He wore a mantle of floating obsidian shards that circled his shoulders like a personal asteroid belt. This was Patriarch Calder. Luther instinctively stiffened his military training, screaming at him to stand at attention, but his legs refused to cooperate. Calder did not look angry. In fact, he looked delighted. A wide, toothy grin stretched across his face, revealing canines that were definitely predatory. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the obsidian shards clinking softly. "The survivor awakens," Calder boomed. His voice was deep enough to rattle the fluid in Luther's chest. "Patriarch," Mira said, bowing her head slightly. "He is stable but fragile." "Fragile nonsense," Calder laughed. He reached out and slapped Luther on the shoulder. It felt like being hit by a sandbag. "He survived the connection, a human surviving the royal resonance." "It is unprecedented. It is marvelous," Luther wheezed, trying to reinflate his lung. "I apologize for the incident, sir. I was just—" "Apologize," Calder interrupted, looking genuinely confused. "Why would you apologize for destiny?" Luther looked at Mira. Mira looked at the floor, biting her lip. "Destiny?" Luther asked warily. "The law of the reach is clear," Calder declared, spreading his arms wide. "To carry a life across the void is to bind it to your own." You grasped the oath rings in the height of the echo tide. You held fast when the world broke. You shared the bioelectric surge. Calder leaned in close, his golden eyes shining with an intensity that was absolutely terrifying. "I have reviewed the footage from the drone," Calder said. "It was magnificent. A true display of commitment." "It was a rescue," Luther said weakly. "It was a proposal," Calder roared, slamming his fist into his open palm. Luther choked. "A what?" "A proposal," Calder beamed. "Congratulations, human. You are the groom." Luther sat there, mouth open, his brain completely failing to process the information. He looked past Calder toward the back of the room. The heavy curtains separated the medical bay from the hallway, parted slightly. Isolde stood there. She had changed out of her armor into a long, flowing robe of violet silk, but she looked like she wanted to murder someone. Or everyone. She met Luther's gaze. Her ears were pressed flat against her skull. Her face was composed, but the tips of her ears were burning with that same iridescent purple blush. She looked mortified. She looked trapped. She raised one hand and drew a finger across her throat in a universal gesture that transcended species barriers. "You are dead." Luther looked back at Calder, who was now explaining something about a feast and a ritual involving lava eels. "Mira," Luther whispered, his voice trembling. "Tell me I am still hallucinating." "Sorry, Luther," Mira whispered back, patting his arm with pity. "Welcome to the family. Try not to let them eat you." The realization hit Luther like a mortar shell. He hadn't just saved a life. He had accidentally invoked an ancient binding and apparently legally enforceable marriage pact with the heir to the most powerful warlord in the sector. He did the only sensible thing a veteran soldier could do in such a tactical situation. "I think my coma is coming back," Luther announced. And then he let his eyes roll back in his head and slumped onto the pillows. "He is overwhelmed with joy," Calder shouted to the room. "Fetch the ceremonial wine from the shadows." Isolde buried her face in her hands. The echo tide outside raged on, but the storm inside the room was just beginning. The morning light in the Spire of Whispers did not break. It filtered through the translucent obsidian walls in hues of deep indigo and bruised violet. It gave the impression of being underwater, or perhaps inside a very expensive, very dangerous aquarium. Luther sat at a table carved from a single slab of floating slate. The furniture hovered 6 inches off the floor, held in place by localized gravity anchors that hummed with a sound just on the edge of human hearing. In front of him sat a bowl containing something that looked like a nest of sapphire eels swimming in mercury. "Eat!" Patriarch Calder boomed from the head of the table. "It is gag root stew, good for the neural pathways. You will need strong nerves for the ceremony." Luther stared at the eels. One of them surfaced and seemed to look at him with a judgment that felt entirely too personal. "I am not hungry," Luther said, pushing the bowl a fraction of an inch away. I am confused, and I am arguably a hostage. Guest, Calder corrected, slicing into a massive purple fruit with a knife that looked like it could decapitate a tank. Honored guest, and soon family. To Luther's right sat Dr. Mira. She was eating the stew with disturbing enthusiasm, seemingly unfazed by the fact that her breakfast was moving. She paused, spoon, halfway to her mouth and glanced at Luther. Eat the mercury soup, Luther, she advised. Your electrolytes are shot from the feedback loop yesterday. If you pass out during the argument, you lose by default. To Luther's left sat Isolde. She had not spoken a word since they sat down. She was dressed in a high-collared tunic of woven, intricate silver mesh that seemed to cling to her armor-plated shoulders like liquid metal. Her posture was rigid, a statue of regal fury. Her tail, usually a graceful extension of her spine, was coiled tight around the leg of her floating chair, the bioluminescent rings pulsing a slow, warning red. Let us discuss this law, Luther said, looking directly at Calder. I have read the Colonial Charter. I have read the Trade Federation bylaws. Nowhere does it say that saving someone from falling into a gravity well constitutes a marriage proposal. Calder put down his knife. The sound of metal on stone rang through the high-ceiling chamber. You speak of paper laws, Calder said, his voice, dropping an octave, losing its jovial edge. Written by men who live on planets where the ground stays still. Here in the Reach, we live by the laws of the void. Calder stood up. He was immense, blocking out the light from the window behind him. The echo tide is not just weather human. It is a tearing of the veil. When the tide rises, the boundary between the living and the lost becomes thin. To grab a soul that is falling into the sheer, to physically tether them to your own mass, while the gravity inverts is to say to the universe, I bind this life to mine. Calder leaned over the table, his golden eyes locking onto Luther. You did not just pull her up. You absorbed her bioelectric discharge through the tail grip. You shared the resonance. In the eyes of the Cathari, you effectively shouted a vow of eternal protection across the psychic spectrum. To undo it now would be to declare that her life was not worth saving. It would be a public rejection of her worth. Luther rubbed his temples. The headache from the previous day was retreating, but the logic of this conversation was bringing it back. I am a mechanic, he said flatly. I fix broken signal towers. I do not have a resonance. I have tinnitus and a bad knee. I saved her because she was falling. That is instinct, not romance. Romance is a luxury, Calder said, sitting back down. Survival is a pact. He is right technically, Dr. Mira interjected, wiping her mouth with a napkin. I checked the anthropological database this morning. In Cathari culture, a contract is not signed with ink. It is signed with gravity. You altered her gravitational destiny. You are on the hook, Luther. This is ridiculous, Luther snapped. He turned to Isolde. You are the Air Scout. You are educated. You have been to the core systems. You cannot possibly agree with this. Isolde slowly turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were cool, devoid of the amber warmth he had seen when she was falling. It does not matter what I agree with, she said. Her voice was calm, but Luther noticed her hand resting on the table. She was holding a heavy silver spoon. As she spoke, her thumb pressed into the handle. My father's position is precarious. The clans are restless. If the patriarch's daughter is saved by an outlander, and then that outlander rejects the bond, it looks like weakness. It looks like the heir is so devoid of value that even a human stray does not want her. The thick, silver neck of the spoon bent backward. Then with a soft snap, the metal sheared completely in two. Isolde dropped the broken pieces onto the table. Clink, clink. I will not let my father's authority be challenged because you have commitment issues, she said. We will proceed with the rite of acknowledgement. It is a formality. Once the tide recedes and the clans return to their holds, we can dissolve the bond quietly. Quietly, Luther repeated, looking at the broken spoon. Right. You seem like a very quiet family. It is settled. Calder clapped his hands, the boom echoing off the walls. Finish your stew. The tailor is waiting. If you are going to be presented to the Storm Council, you cannot look like a sack of discarded potatoes. The walk from the dining hall to the preparation chambers was an exercise in paranoia. The Cathari settlement, known as the High Hold, was carved directly into the spire of a suspended mountain. Corridors were open to the air, with only thin energy fields keeping the atmosphere inside. Outside, the echo tide was getting worse. The violet clouds churned like oil and water, and the floating rocks of the canyon smashed into each other with the sound of distant thunder. Luther walked a few paces behind Isolde, flanked by Oren. The giant bodyguard had not said a word, but his breathing was heavy and deliberate like a compressor engine idling. Every time Luther stumbled slightly on the uneven floor, Oren's hand would hover near his weapon, as if gravity tripping Luther was an assassination attempt. Stop staring at the back of my head, Isolde said without turning around. I am not staring at your head, Luther said. I am staring at your tail. Oren growled a low, vibrating rumble that shook Luther's ribcage. Calm down, big guy, Luther said, raising a hand. I am looking at the rings. Look at the pulse rate. Isolde stopped. She turned her tail, sweeping a defensive arc behind her. What about them, the pulse, Luther said, pointing. It is not random. It is syncing with the external atmospheric pressure. Every time the tide surges outside, your rings flare up by 12%, and the color shift, it is moving from blue to violet. Isolde looked back at her own tail, frowning. It is a natural reaction to the background radiation. No, Luther shook his head. Biology adapts. This is receiving. It looks like a handshake protocol. He stepped closer, his engineer's eye taking over, forgetting for a moment that he was speaking to royalty. These rings are not just bioluminescence, are they? They are conductive. They are a biointerface. Isolde stiffened. She pulled her tail away, tucking it closer to her leg. You see too much human. Luther, he corrected. My name is Luther. And if you are an antenna for this storm that explains why you fell yesterday, the null choir device, it didn't just mess with gravity. It sent a signal that overloaded your receiver. Isolde's eyes widened slightly. She exchanged a glance with Oren. It was a look of guarded surprise. We do not discuss the nature of the Cathari physiology with outsiders, Oren grunted, stepping between them. He is right, though, Isolde said softly. She looked at Luther with a new assessment. The echo tide connects us. It is how we navigate the shifts. But lately, the connection feels dirty, like static in the blood. Someone is jamming the signal, Luther said, or rewriting it. They passed an open plaza where a group of Cathari civilians were gathered. A mother was holding a young child pointing at the sky. Suddenly, the woman stopped. Her face went blank. She looked down at the child in her arms with absolute terrifying emptiness. Who? The woman whispered, her voice trembling. Who does this belong to? The child began to cry. The sound seemed to snap the woman back. She blinked, clutching the child, tight terror flooding her face. I am sorry, she sobbed. I am sorry, I forgot. I just forgot. Luther felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Memory slippage, he said. It is starting. It is the tide, Oren said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Isolde said, her jaw tightening. The tide takes memories of the dead. It never touches the living like this. The null choir is escalating. They are not waiting for the storm to peak. They are pushing it. She turned and began to walk faster. We need to get this farce of a ceremony over with. I need to be in the command center, not playing dress-up. The preparation for the ceremony felt less like a wedding fitting and more like being packed for shipping. Luther stood on a pedestal, in a room filled with floating mirrors. 3 Cathari attendants were aggressively wrapping him in layers of heavy, stiff fabric that smelled of ozone and incense. "It is too tight in the shoulders," Luther complained, trying to rotate his arm. The fabric groaned, but did not give. "It is supposed to be tight," one of the attendants said, pinning a heavy brooch made of meteoric iron onto Luther's chest. "It represents the crushing weight of responsibility." "How festive," Luther muttered. The outer coat was a deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver threads that formed the constellation of the Cathari homeworld. The collar was high and rigid, forcing Luther to keep his chin up and his back straight. Dr. Mira was sitting on a bench nearby, eating a green apple and enjoying the show entirely too much. "You look dashing," she said. "Like a very angry, very expensive antenna." "I feel like a sausage wrapped in a carpet," Luther said. "How am I supposed to fight in this? Or run? Or breathe?" "You are not supposed to fight," Mira said. "You are supposed to stand there, look solemn, and let Patriarch Calder recount your glorious deeds. Then you exchange a piece of glass bow to the 4 winds, and boom, you are technically a prince consort. Or at least a probationary one." "And if I sneeze?" "Do not sneeze," Mira said seriously. "Sneezing during the rite is interpreted as expelling the soul of the ancestors. They would have to exorcise you. It involves stinging nettles." Luther sighed, looking at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked like a stranger. The gray stubble on his chin clashed with the regal silk. The scars on his hands looked jagged against the smooth fabric. He looked exactly what he was, a piece of rough scrap metal wrapped in velvet. "Why is Calder doing this, Mira?" Luther asked, lowering his voice. "He knows I am a fake. He knows I just grabbed her tail to stop her from dying. Why the theater?" Mira stopped chewing. Her expression softened, the humor fading. "Because the high hold is scared Luther. I have been their doctor for 5 years. I have never seen the memory slips this bad. Calder needs a win. He needs to show that the Cathari can bind anything to their will, even a chaotic element like a human. He is using you to project stability." "Stability," Luther scoffed. "I am the definition of unstable." "You are a survivor," Mira said. "And right now, that is the only currency that matters." Before Luther could respond, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of sound. The hum of the gravity anchors stopped. The rustle of the attendant's fabric stopped. The distant roar of the wind outside stopped. Total, absolute silence. Luther's combat instincts, dormant, but never dead, screamed an alarm in his brain. Silence is not natural. "Down!" Luther shouted, tackling Mira off the bench. The wall of the dressing chamber exploded inward. It wasn't an explosive blast. It was a sonic impact. The stone shattered into dust driven by a focused wave of sound, so intense it liquefied the masonry. Luther and Mira hit the floor covered in debris. The 3 attendants were not so lucky. They stood frozen, their eyes wide mouths open in silent screams. They weren't dead, but they were paralyzed, their neural pathways locked by the frequency. "Sonic suppression!" Luther yelled, his ears ringing. "Cover your ears!" Through the hole in the wall, 3 figures floated in on gravity discs. They wore sleek white armor that looked like porcelain featureless masks covering their faces. The Null Choir. One of them held a device similar to the one Luther had seen on the bridge, a tuning fork weapon, but this one was the size of a rifle. He pointed it at the paralyzed attendants. "Dissonance," the figure spoke. The voice was synthesized, harmonic, and terrifying. "The choir demands silence." Luther scrambled to his feet, hindered by the heavy ceremonial coat. He grabbed a heavy metal basin from a washstand and hurled it. The basin hit the lead attacker in the chest, knocking his aim off. The sonic blast hit a mirror, shattering it into a million vibrating shards. "Run!" Luther grabbed Mira and shoved her toward the door. They burst into the hallway only to find chaos. The sonic weapon had hit the entire sector. Guards were slumped against walls, clutching their heads, unable to move. The weapon didn't just hurt. It scrambled the motor cortex. They are here for Isolde, Luther realized. She is in the atrium, Mira gasped, checking her datapad. Preparation ceremony. Luther didn't wait. He hiked up the heavy robes and ran. The atrium was a massive circular chamber, with a floor made of glass, looking down 3 miles into the storm below. Isolde was there, surrounded by a dozen Null Choir soldiers. She was a blur of silver and violet motion. She had no weapon, ceremonial rules forbade it, so she was using the environment. She moved like water, redirecting the momentum of the attackers, using her tail to sweep legs and shatter gravity disks. But she was overwhelmed. The Null Choir soldiers were coordinating their attacks using a rhythmic pulse that seemed to counter her movements. Every time she moved to strike, a sonic blast forced her back. And in the center of the room, a massive tripod had been set up. It was a larger version of the sonic weapon, aimed directly at the floor, at the structural integrity point of the spire. They are going to drop the atrium, Luther realized. He skidded into the room. Orin was there on his knees, blood trickling from his ears, trying to lift his heavy repeater, but unable to focus his eyes. One of the white armored soldiers turned toward Luther. "The Groom," the soldier intoned. An ugly note in the song. He raised his weapon. Luther didn't dodge. He knew he couldn't move fast enough in the heavy coat. Instead, he slammed his hand onto the control panel of the nearest decorative gravity fountain. "Mira!" Luther shouted. "Overload the localized dampeners!" "What?" Mira yelled from the doorway. "Do it!" Mira tapped frantically on her datapad. Luther ripped the cover off the fountain's maintenance panel. He saw the gravity coils humming. He didn't have tools. He had his hands. He grabbed the positive and negative couplings. "Isolde!" Luther roared. "Get low!" Isolde didn't question him. She dropped flat to the glass floor. Luther yanked the cables, crossing the streams. The gravity fountain screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a sheer tear in the physical laws of the room. A shockwave of inverted gravity exploded outward from Luther's position. Luther was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. The heavy ceremonial coat absorbed some of the impact, but his ribs groaned in protest. The effect on the Null Choir was catastrophic. Their gravity disks, calibrated for standard physics, couldn't handle the sudden inversion. They were slammed into the ceiling, then smashed back down to the floor as the field fluctuated wildly. The large tripod weapon toppled over, its harmonics disrupted. The silence broke. The noise of the world rushed back in shouts, alarms, wind. Isolde was up instantly. With the sonic suppression gone, she was a predator unleashed. She grabbed the fallen tripod leg, using it as a staff. It was brutal and efficient. Within 10 seconds, 3 soldiers were unconscious, and the rest were retreating through the breach in the ceiling. One soldier remained pinned under the wreckage of the tripod. He reached for a detonator on his belt. Luther, gasping for breath, saw it. He lunged, sliding across the glass floor, and kicked the detonator out of the soldier's hand. The soldier looked up at Luther. The mask was cracked. Beneath it, Luther saw human eyes, terrified, vacant eyes. "The song," the soldier whispered. "Why won't you let us stop the pain?" Then the soldier convulsed and went limp. A failsafe. Luther sat back against the tripod, his chest heaving. The heavy coat was torn, the meteoric iron brooch hanging by a thread. Isolde walked over to him. She was breathing hard, a shallow cut on her cheek, bleeding purple blood. She looked at the devastation, then down at Luther. "You reversed the gravity polarity of a decorative fountain," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "I improvised," Luther wheezed. "It was effective." "You could have collapsed the floor." "But I didn't." Isolde reached down. For a moment, Luther thought she was going to hit him. Instead, She grabbed the collar of his ruined coat and hauled him to his feet. "You fight ugly," she said. "I fight to win," Luther corrected. Patriarch Calder burst into the room a moment later, surrounded by his elite guard. He took in the scene: the smashed droids, the unconscious attackers, the reversed gravity fountain sparking in the corner. His eyes went to Luther. The joy was gone from his face. For the first time, Luther saw the warlord beneath the jovial mask. Calder looked old. He looked tired. "They struck inside the spire," Calder said quietly. "They mocked the right." "They were targeting the Foundation," Luther said, pointing to the tripod. "They weren't trying to kidnap her, Calder. They were trying to drop the heir into the abyss." Calder walked over to the dead soldier. He looked at the white armor. "The Null Choir has never been this aggressive. They usually preach. Now they purge." He turned to Luther. "You are a target now, human. Truly. By standing with her, you have placed yourself in the path of the song." "I noticed," Luther said, brushing dust off his shoulder. "Can I take this coat off now? It smells like burnt ozone." "No," Calder said, his voice hardening again. "The ceremony proceeds." "Are you insane?" Luther shouted. "We were just attacked. The security is compromised." "The ceremony proceeds," Calder roared, his voice shaking the glass floor. "If we stop now, they win. If we hide, they win. We will show them that the Cathari do not break. We do not pause for terrorists. We bind our alliances in blood and fire if we must." Calder marched out of the room, barking orders to double the perimeter. Luther stood there stunned. He looked at Isolde. "Your father is going to get us killed," Luther said. Isolde looked at the door where her father had exited. Her expression was unreadable, but her hand was trembling slightly. She clenched it into a fist to stop the shaking. She stepped close to Luther, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her armor. She smelled of rain and hot metal. "He is afraid," Isolde whispered. "He knows the tide is turning against him. He needs a symbol." "I am not a symbol," Luther said. "I am a mechanic who wants to go home." Isolde looked him in the eyes. The amber glow was back, burning low and intense. "It is too late for that, Luther. You touch the void. You are part of the circuit now." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that was equal parts threat and plea. "If you want to run now. I will not stop you. But if you stand on that podium with me." She paused, glancing at his hands, the hands that had rewired a fountain to save her. "If you stay, do not expect me to protect you. You have to survive on your own. Because when the music starts, Luther, everyone dances, or everyone dies." She turned and walked away, her tail lashing behind her, the rings pulsing a steady, rhythmic violet. Luther stood alone in the wrecked atrium. He looked at the broken Null Choir mask on the floor. "Great," Luther muttered to the empty room. "I hate dancing." The floating archive of the Cathari did not look like a building. It looked like a geode that had been cracked open by a giant hand and left to drift in the upper atmospheric currents of the Eidolon Reach. Suspended by 3 massive gravity tethers that hummed with a low, bone-shaking baritone, the structure was a collection of crystalline spires and floating platforms rotating slowly around a central core of pure condensed data light. To the Cathari, this was the repository of their history. To Luther, it looked like a very complicated place to die. "So," Luther said, adjusting the collar of his stiff ceremonial coat, which he had repaired with industrial tape and a prayer. "Let me get the plan straight. We walk into the most secure facility in the hemisphere, which is currently on high alert because of the terrorist attack we just survived, and we ask to see the classified maps." "We do not ask," Isolde said. She was standing at the helm of the skiff, the wind whipping her violet cloak around her armor. She looked less like a bride and more like a spear point. "We demand, as is the right of the heir." And when they say no, Luther asked. Then you lie, Isolde said, turning to look at him. You are good at lying, are you not? You said you have been pretending to be fine for 20 years. Luther grimaced. That was a figure of speech, and it is closer to 15 years. Just play the part, Luther, Dr. Mira said from the passenger seat. She was checking her medical kit, counting vials of adrenaline. You are the groom. You are the exotic outlander who is so overwhelmed by the majesty of Cathari culture that he simply must see the history of his new family. It is a cultural pilgrimage. I hate pilgrimages, Oren grunted from the back. The massive bodyguard was polishing his kinetic repeater with a cloth that looked suspiciously like a piece of fine silk. If he touches anything he is not supposed to, I shoot him. If you shoot him, Oren, we lose our cover, Isolde said calmly. Shoot him later. Noted, Oren said. The skiff docked at the arrival platform of the archive. The air here was thin and smelled of ozone and old parchment. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their armor, bearing the sigil of the Silent Keepers, the monastic order that guarded the Cathari history. They held heavy staves that crackled with static energy. Isolde stepped off the skiff, first her head held high. Luther followed, trying to look simultaneously regal and harmless. Halt, the lead guard said. His voice was distorted by his helmet. The archive is sealed by order of the Patriarch. The echo tide is rising. No entry. Isolde stopped. She did not look angry. She looked disappointed. It was a terrifying expression. I am Isolde, Air Scout of the High Hold, she said. And this, she gestured to Luther with a sweeping hand, is my betrothed, the one who grasped the rings. The guards looked at Luther. Luther offered a weak, lopsided smile and waved. Hi, Luther said. Big fan of the floating rocks. Just really impressive masonry. He wishes to understand the lineage he is joining, Isolde continued, her voice smooth as polished glass. Would you deny a stranger the chance to learn our ways? Would you have the High Hold say that the keepers turned away the groom on the eve of the binding? The guards hesitated. The politics of the tail grip were messy, and offending the heir was dangerous. But offending the Patriarch was worse. Our orders are strict, the guard said, though his grip on the staff loosened slightly. Luther stepped forward. He channeled every clueless officer he had ever escorted through a war zone. He widened his eyes and looked at the archway with childlike wonder. I just want to see where you keep the old stories, Luther said. Isolde tells me you have crystals that sing. That sounds magical. Where I come from, we just have hard drives that overheat. I traveled 5,000 light years. Surely a 5-minute tour is not breaking the law. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Between us, if I do not learn the history, her father is going to feed me to the lava eels. You would be doing me a solid. The guard looked at Luther, then at Isolde, and finally sighed. The absurdity of the request combined with the presence of the heir broke the bureaucratic deadlock. Only the outer gallery, the guard said, stepping aside. And do not touch the resonance crystals. If you corrupt a memory, the archive defense system will erase your mind to balance the equation. Understood, Luther said, beaming. No touching. I am great at not touching things. Oren snorted loudly behind him. The interior of the archive was a cathedral of silence. There were no floors, only floating hexagonal stones that formed pathways through the vast, open space. The air was filled with millions of tiny floating crystals, each one glowing with a faint inner light. They were memories, recorded moments of Cathari history, preserved in psionic glass. This way, Isolde whispered, leading them away from the approved tour path and toward the darker lower levels. The navigational charts are in the deep vault. I thought we promised not to touch anything, Dr. Mira hissed, looking nervously at a cloud of crystals that drifted too close to her head. We lied, Isolde said. They descended deeper into the archive. The light shifted from warm gold to a cold, sterile blue. The air grew colder. The humming sound of the gravity tethers became a physical vibration in their teeth. "This place gives me the creeps," Luther muttered. "It feels like a graveyard." "It is," Orin said somberly. "Every crystal is a mind that is past. We are walking through the thoughts of the dead." "Cheery," Luther said. They reached a massive circular door, made of a dark, non-reflective metal. It had no handle, no keypad, and no visible hinges. In the center was a complex arrangement of rotating rings and shifting geometric shapes. "The deep vault," Isolde said. "It contains the atmospheric data from the first arrival. If we can find the pattern of the ancient storms, I can predict where the null choir will strike next to amplify the tide." She reached out to touch the lock, but stopped. The rings were spinning too fast. "It is a resonant lock," Isolde said, frustrated. "It requires a specific harmonic frequency to open. A password sung in a key I do not know." Luther stepped up to the door. He narrowed his eyes. He had seen this design before, not on a Cathari ruin, but on a pieces of salvage he had stripped from a derelict battleship in the core systems 10 years ago. It was xenotech, sure, but the logic was mathematical. "It is not a song," Luther said quietly. "It is a waveform equation." He reached into his tool belt, which he had insisted on wearing under the ceremonial coat, and pulled out his sonic multi-tool. "What are you doing?" Orin growled. "You will trigger the alarm." "I am tuning it," Luther said. He adjusted the frequency on his tool. "This is a 3-stage tumble lock. It looks biological, but it is mechanical. See the delay in the third ring. It is lagging by 0.4 seconds. Luther held the tool against the metal. He tapped a rhythm on the casing. Tap, 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 tap. The spinning rings slowed down. They clicked into place with a heavy mechanical thud that felt oddly familiar to Luther's hands. It was the same feeling as disarming a proximity mine. A click that meant safety. The door groaned and slid open. Isolde stared at him. "How did you do that?" "That is pre-collapse technology. Only the keepers know the harmonics." Luther put his tool away, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't know how he knew. His fingers had just moved. It was muscle memory for a task he didn't remember learning. "I told you," Luther said, his voice tight. "I am good with broken things. Let's get the map." Inside the vault, the air was freezing. In the center of the room, a massive hologram projected a swirling, 3-dimensional map of the Eidolon Reach. But it wasn't just a map. It was alive. It showed the gravity tides moving like ocean currents. "There," Isolde pointed. "The primary ley lines. If the null choir hits the intersection at the Obsidian Rift, they can invert the gravity of the entire sector." "They are not just trying to change the weather," Dr. Mira said, scanning the data with her medical tablet. "Look at the waveform. It is a carrier signal. They are trying to broadcast a command." "We need to copy this," Isolde said. She pulled out a data shard. As she worked, Orin wandered toward the edge of the room. A large, jagged crystal sat on a pedestal pulsing with a red, angry light. It was different from the others. It pulled at the eye. "Orin, do not," Luther warned. But Orin, entranced, reached out a finger. The moment he touched it, the room screamed. It wasn't a noise. It was a psychic backlash. Orin jerked back, clutching his head. He fell to his knees, his eyes rolling back. "No, no, I held the line," Orin shouted, his voice reverting to a younger, terrified version of himself. "The flank is broken, Mother. The flank is broken." "He is in a memory loop," Mira yelled, rushing to him. She slapped a transdermal inhibitor onto his neck. "His brain is rewinding to his worst trauma. Help me hold him." Luther grabbed Orin's shoulder, trying to steady the thrashing giant. "Orin, it is not real. You are in the archive." "They are coming," Orin screamed, swinging his fist blindly. He struck Luther in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. Too many of them. We have the data, Isolde shouted, pulling the shard free. We have to go, the defense systems are waking up. The blue light in the room turned to a harsh, flashing crimson. A mechanical voice echoed from the walls. Corruption detected. Purge protocol initiated. Sanctity of memory must be preserved. Run! Luther gasped, hauling Orin up. The inhibitor was working. Orin was slumping his eyes, regaining focus, though he looked dazed and sick. They bolted from the vault, back into the open gallery. But the path was blocked. Standing on the walkway blocking their exit were 5 figures in white porcelain armor. And in front of them stood High Cantor Sable. He was tall, slender, and wore a mask that covered only the lower half of his face. His eyes were exposed pale, watery, and incredibly old. He held no weapon. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, as if admiring a painting. A beautiful performance, Sable said. His voice did not sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like it came from the air itself. It resonated in Luther's chest, vibrating his ribs. It was a voice that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the nervous system. Herr Isolde, Sable said, bowing slightly. And the groom. I was hoping to meet you before the end. Move, Isolde warned, her hand going to the blade at her hip. Or, I will add your memory to this collection, Sable chuckled. It sounded like water flowing over gravel. Violence is such a crude discord. We only seek harmony. The Reach is in pain, Isolde. It is screaming in 1,000 different voices. We wish to give it one voice, one song. He turned his gaze to Luther. Luther felt a cold pressure on his mind, like a thumb pressing against his frontal lobe. And you, Sable said softly. The anomaly, the man who opens ancient locks with a mechanic's wrench. Luther stepped forward, placing himself between Sable and the others. I have a face. You can look at it while I punch you. Sable tilted his head. So aggressive. But tell me, Luther, when you opened that door, did it feel like discovery? Or did it feel like remembering? Luther froze. You have scars on your body, Sable continued, taking a slow step forward. But you have gaps in your mind. Are you sure your memories are yours, veteran? Or are they just a story someone wrote for you? Shut up, Luther said. The war you remember, Sable pressed, his voice rising in pitch, becoming a painful whine. The battles, the losses. Why do they feel so distant? Why do the numbers never quite add up? Luther's vision blurred. He saw flashes: a white room, a needle, a voice counting down from 10. Not the war, not Cinder Prime, somewhere else. Luther, Isolde's voice cut through the fog. Do not listen. It is a resonant attack. Luther shook his head violently. He grabbed a handful of the floating memory crystals from a nearby cluster and hurled them at Sable. Catch! Luther yelled. Sable raised a hand to deflect them, but the crystals shattered against his psionic shield. The release of energy created a cloud of chaotic psychic noise, screams, laughter, speeches, all playing at once. The distraction broke Sable's hold. The Null Choir soldiers clutched their helmets, disoriented by the noise. Go! Luther shouted. He didn't run back toward the skiff. The guards were there. He ran toward the edge of the platform. Where are we going? Dr. Mira shrieked, dragging the groggy Orin. The bridges, Luther pointed to the network of floating stones that connected the archive to the distant canyon wall. We jump! That is suicide, Mira yelled. It is a Tuesday, Luther retorted. They leaped from the platform onto the nearest floating stone. The stone dipped dangerously under their weight. Keep moving, Isolde commanded. Do not let the gravity stabilize. They sprinted across the gap, leaping from rock to rock. Behind them, the Null Choir opened fire. Sonic bolts smashed into the stones, pulverizing them into dust. One bolt hit the stone Luther was standing on. It disintegrated. Luther fell. For the second time in 2 days, he was plummeting into the abyss. Luther. A hand clamped around his wrist. A strong, armored hand. Isolde was lying flat on the next stone holding him. Her heels were dug into a crack in the rock, her tail wrapped around a protrusion for leverage. Luther dangled 3,000 feet above the storm. He looked up at her. Her helmet was gone. Her hair was whipping in the wind. Her eyes were fierce, burning with amber fire. "I have you," she gritted out. Luther looked at her hand gripping his wrist. He looked at her face. The adrenaline made everything sharp and vivid. "Hey!" Luther shouted over the wind. "Just for the record, I am asking permission this time." Isolde stared at him. Then, incredibly, she laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of laughter, surprised out of her. "Permission granted!" she yelled. She heaved him up. Luther scrambled onto the rock, collapsing beside her. "You are an idiot," she said, breathing hard. "I am consistent," Luther gasped. They were not safe yet. The Null Choir was pursuing on gravity disks, closing the distance. The bridge ahead was too wide to jump. "We are trapped," Orin said, finally regaining his senses. He raised his repeater. "I have 12 rounds. I can take 3 of them." "That leaves 2 for us," Mira said dryly. Suddenly, a section of the canyon wall exploded. It wasn't an attack. It was an opening. A concealed hangar door blasted outward, and a small, rusted mining ship shot out. It spun on its axis, firing a barrage of flares that blinded the Null Choir sensors. The ship pulled up alongside their rock. The side hatch hissed open. Standing there was a woman with cybernetic implants covering half her face, and the Null Choir tattoos burned off her neck. She held a heavy carbine. "Get in!" she screamed. "Unless you want to be sheet music." "Who is that?" Luther asked. "A variable," Isolde said. "Move." They scrambled into the ship. The hatch sealed and the pilot punched the thrusters. The ship rocketed away into the storm, leaving the archive and the Null Choir behind. The interior of the ship was a mess of wires and stolen tech. The pilot, Juniper, spun the chair around to face them. She looked terrified, sweating profusely. "I am Juniper," she said, her hands shaking on her weapon. "I was one of them. 6th Choir. Logistics." Isolde moved faster than Luther could track. In a heartbeat, she had her blade against Juniper's throat, pinning her against the console. "Give me one reason not to open your throat," Isolde hissed. "You wear their marks." "I defected," Juniper choked out. "I saw what they did to the colony at Vector 9. They didn't just harmonize them. They erased them. I won out." "A traitor is just a spy who hasn't been caught yet," Isolde said, pressing the blade deeper. A bead of blood welled up. "Isolde, stop," Luther said. He stepped forward, putting his hand on Isolde's arm. "She is the enemy, Luther," Isolde said, her eyes cold. "She saved us," Luther said. "And she is shaking. Look at her." "Fear is a good disguise," Isolde countered. "If we kill everyone who was forced to serve them," Luther said quietly, "then we are just doing Sable's work for him. If we kill the coerced, we only leave the coercers. Is that the kind of queen you want to be?" Isolde froze. She looked at Luther, then at the terrified woman. Slowly, she lowered the blade. "Talk," Isolde commanded Juniper. "Fast," Juniper slumped, rubbing her neck. "Thank you. You don't understand what they are doing. The storm vault isn't just a power source. It is an instrument, a planetary organ." "An organ?" Mira asked. "Like lungs?" "No," Juniper said. "Like a pipe organ. The crystals, the gravity wells, the wind, are all part of a machine designed to play a specific resonant frequency. If Sable gets inside the storm vault, he won't just control the weather. He will play a note so loud, it will rewrite the neural pathways of every living thing in the Reach. He calls it the final concord. No more war. No more disagreement. Just silence." The cabin fell silent. The horror of it settled on them like a heavy blanket. "Total synchronization," Luther murmured. "Peace through lobotomy." Isolde holstered her blade. She walked to the viewport and looked out at the raging storm. She looked small against the vastness of the chaos outside. Luther walked over to join her. "You okay?" he asked softly. "No," Isolde said. She didn't look at him. "I was raised to be a symbol, Luther. The heir, the scout, the face of the hold. My father treats me like a flag to be waved, and Sable wants to turn us all into notes in his song." She turned to him. Her eyes were vulnerable for the first time. "I am terrified," she whispered. "I am terrified that I am not a person, that I am just a function, a key to a lock I didn't choose." Luther leaned against the bulkhead. He looked at his hands, the hands that had opened the lock, the hands that remembered things he didn't. "I know the feeling," Luther said. His voice was rough. "I came here to hide, to be nobody. But everywhere I go, things break. Or I break them. Or I fix them in ways I shouldn't know how to." He looked at Isolde. "I am scared that Sable is right," Luther confessed. "I am scared that my past isn't just a tragedy. I am scared that it is a blueprint, and that I am just a weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger." Isolde reached out. She didn't grab his tail, he didn't have one, and she didn't grab his wrist. She touched his hand, her fingers brushing his scarred knuckles. "Then we will be broken together," Isolde said fiercely. "And if they try to play us, we will play our own song." Luther looked at their hands. "Is that a metaphor?" "Yes," Isolde said, a ghost of a smile returning. "Do not ruin it." "Wouldn't dream of it," Luther said. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the rusted mining ship, for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. Toward the desert, toward the storm vault, toward the truth that might destroy them both. The descent into the Aurora Desert was not a journey across a landscape. It was a traversal into the open throat of a dying planet. The skiff shuddered violently as it crossed the perimeter line, the navigational thrusters screaming against the atmospheric density. Here, the laws of the Eidolon Reach were not just bent. They were broken and left to rot. The sand did not lie on the ground. Millions of tons of silica, charged by the magnetic fury of the ecotide above, flowed upward in slow, mesmerizing rivers, rising from the bedrock to join the bruised violet clouds. It looked like the world was evaporating. Luther gripped the safety rail of the skiff, his knuckles white. The air inside the cabin tasted of copper and ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. "Atmospheric pressure is rising," Dr. Mira said from the co-pilot seat. She was monitoring a console that was lit up with more red warning lights than Luther had ever seen in one place. "The ecotide is peaking. We have maybe 4 hours before the resonance becomes permanent." "Define permanent," Luther said, looking out at the inverted rain of sand. "I mean that if we are still out here when the true storm hits," Dr. Mira replied, adjusting her glasses. "We won't just forget who we are. We will become part of the background radiation. We will be ghosts in the static." Patriarch Calder stood at the rear of the troop transport, looking out the viewport with a calmness that Luther found deeply unsettling. The massive Cathari warlord was checking the charge on a heavy plasma cannon, his movements precise and relaxed. "The storm vault lies beneath the crucible of silence," Calder said, his deep voice rumbling over the whine of the engines. "It is the only place on the planet where the wind does not blow. But to get there, we must cross the interference zone." Calder turned his golden eyes toward Luther. It was a look devoid of the warmth he had feigned during the engagement dinner. It was the look a mechanic gave to a specific, necessary wrench. "You must be ready, Groom," Calder said. "The vault does not open for strength. It opens for resonance. You and Isolde, you are the key." "I am not a key," Luther muttered, checking his own gear. "I am a man who wants a nap." "You are what I say you are," Calder said, and for a second the threat hung heavy in the recycled air. Then the patriarch smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Try not to die. It would be inconvenient for the paperwork. Isolde sat opposite Luther, sharpening her blade. She had not spoken for an hour. Her tail was coiled tight around her waist, the bioluminescent rings dim, conserving energy. She looked up, catching Luther's gaze. There was no regal arrogance there now, only a grim, focused terror. She knew what lay ahead better than any of them. "We are landing," the pilot announced. "Gravity stabilizers are failing. We have to walk from here." The ramp descended, and the heat hit them like a physical blow. It wasn't hot like a fire. It was a cold burn, the chill of the void, mixed with the friction of the rising sands. They stepped out onto the bedrock. The landscape was a nightmare of beauty. Towering spires of crystallized salt glowed with an internal blue light. The sky was a churning ceiling of violet and black so low it felt like you could reach up and touch the storm. And everywhere the sand flowed up, creating a dizzying, inverted vertigo. "Stay close," Orin barked, his voice amplified by his helmet. "The magnetic fields here can pull the iron right out of your blood if you linger in a hot spot." They moved in a tight formation. Luther, Isolde, Orin, Dr. Mira Juniper, and Calder's elite guard. They passed a group of refugees nomads who had been caught in the outer rim of the storm. They were sitting in a circle, staring at the rising sand. One of them, an old Cathari woman, looked up as Luther passed. Her eyes were blank, washed clean of recognition. "Have you seen my son?" she asked softly. "He was just here. He was holding my hand." Luther looked down. The woman's hand was still raised, gripping empty air. "He is gone, Mother," a younger Cathari, beside her, whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He walked into the light an hour ago. You forgot him." "I did not," the woman insisted, her voice trembling. "I do not forget. I am... She frowned, looking at her own hands. "Who am I?" Luther looked away, his stomach twisting. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice rough. "We cannot help them." "If we stop Sable," Isolde said, her voice steel hard, "we help everyone. If we fail, we all end up like that." They pushed deeper into the crucible. The terrain grew treacherous. The gravity here was not uniform. One step felt like lead. The next felt like walking on the moon. They reached a narrow ridge overlooking a fissure that glowed with radioactive green light. The path was barely 3 feet wide. "Watch your footing!" Orin shouted from the lead position. "Gravity sink on the left." As if on cue, the rock beneath Orin's boot crumbled. It wasn't a standard rock slide. The gravity sink grabbed him, amplifying his mass 100 times in a split second. Orin slammed onto his chest, pinned to the ground as if a mountain had been dropped on his back. He groaned, the sound tearing from his throat, as he began to slide toward the edge of the fissure. "Orin!" Isolde lunged, but the gravity field repelled her, sparking against her armor. Luther didn't lunge. He dropped his pack and pulled out a high-tensile winch cable. "Do not touch him," Luther yelled at the guards who were rushing forward. "The gravity well will crush you too. It is a localized anomaly." Luther scanned the rock face. He saw a deposit of heavy ore, magnetic lodestone, embedded in the cliff above Orin. "Physics," Luther gritted out. "It is just physics." He fired the grapple gun not at Orin, but at the lodestone. The cable snapped taut. Luther wrapped the other end around his waist and jumped, not toward safety, but directly into the gravity well's outer rim. He hit the ground next to Orin, the weight slamming into him like a hammer. He felt his ribs creak. He couldn't lift Orin. The Cathari weighed half a ton in normal gravity, and right now he weighed 10 tons. Luther jammed a reverse polarity mine, a small demolition charge used for clearing debris under Orin's chest plate. "This is going to tickle," Luther wheezed. "What are you?" Orin gasped. Luther hit the detonator. The mine didn't explode with fire. It exploded with a pulse of anti-gravity. For 1 second, Orin was weightless. In that second, the winch cable on Luther's waist, which was under extreme tension, snapped back, yanking both of them backward away from the fissure, just as the gravity sink reasserted itself. They tumbled onto the safe rock, gasping for air. Orin rolled over, coughing up dust. He looked at Luther, then at the fissure, then back at Luther. "You used a breaching mine," Orin choked out. "On my chest." "It worked," Luther said, clutching his bruised side. "You are not a pancake, you are welcome." Orin sat up slowly. He brushed the dust off his armor. He looked at the human with a strange expression. Not friendship, but the grudging acknowledgement of a professional, looking at another professional. "Do not think this means I like you, human," Orin grunted. "I will write it in my diary," Luther retorted, struggling to his feet. "Dear diary, today the giant rock man didn't squash me. It was a good day." "If I still remember how to write by tonight," Orin snorted. It was almost a laugh. "Move out, we are losing time." But the delay had cost them more than time. As they scrambled up the final ridge toward the entrance of the storm vault, the echo tide pulsed. It was a massive subsonic thrum that vibrated the teeth in their skulls. The violet clouds descended, touching the ground. Juniper, who had been walking silently near the back, suddenly stopped. She dropped her weapon. Her eyes, which had been fearful and darting, suddenly went wide and vacant. The pupils dilated until her eyes were entirely black. "The song," Juniper whispered. Her voice changed. It wasn't her voice anymore. It was the harmonic synthesized tone of the null choir. "The conductor calls for the final verse." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a signal flare. If she lit it, the null choir patrols would know exactly where they were. "Juniper, no!" Dr. Mira screamed. Isolde spun around, her blade flashing out. She was lethal and fast. She could take Juniper's head off before the flare was lit. "Do not kill her!" Luther shouted, stepping into Isolde's path. "She is turning!" Isolde yelled. "She is beaconing them!" "She is fighting it!" Luther argued. He turned to Juniper. He didn't grapple her. He didn't point a weapon. He stepped close, right into her personal space, ignoring the flare in her hand. "Juniper!" Luther said sharply. "Look at me!" Juniper's head twitched. "The silence is so loud. I have to harmonize." "No," Luther said. "You don't have to do anything. You are Juniper. You like spicy ration bars. You hate the smell of ozone. You flew a mining ship through a hurricane to save 4 strangers." "The choir," Juniper whimpered, tears leaking from her black eyes. "They know my name." "They know a number," Luther said, intense, gripping her shoulders. "I know your name. I am asking you right now, who do you want to be when no one is giving orders? Do you want to be a note in their song, or do you want to be the one who screams no?" Juniper trembled. The flare hissed as she gripped it tighter. The struggle in her face was terrifying, the programming fighting the personality. Juniper gasped. "I want to scream." She threw the flare, not up into the sky, but down into a fissure. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, the blackness fading from her eyes. Isolde lowered her blade. She looked at Luther with a mix of awe and frustration. "You take too many risks," Isolde whispered. "Calculated risks," Luther said, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "She is our pilot. We need her." They reached the summit. Below them lay the entrance to the storm vault. It was not a door. It was a mouth. A massive archway of obsidianite 300 feet high was carved into the base of a cliff. The stone was etched with millions of runes that pulsed with a rhythm, like a slow, deep breath. The air around it was still dead still. The sand did not rise here. It lay flat, heavy, and gray. As Isolde stepped forward, the runes on the archway flared a brilliant, welcoming gold. The massive stone gates groaned, shifting slightly. The vault recognized the blood of the air. But then Luther stepped forward. The runes didn't just glow. They screamed. The color shifted from gold to a blinding, angry white. The ground shook. The heavy stone doors didn't just open. They slammed apart with a violence that sent shockwaves through the dust. "What is that?" Calder shouted, shielding his eyes. "The vault has never reacted like that, not even for the first patriarch." Isolde looked at Luther, her eyes wide. "It knows you." Luther backed away terrified. "I have never been here, I swear." "It does not matter," Calder roared. "The door is open, go now." But they were too late. From the shadows of the archway, the darkness coalesced. It wasn't shadow. It was camouflage. 50 soldiers of the Null Choir decloaked instantly. They were already inside. They had been waiting. "An impatient key," a voice echoed. High Cantor Sable stepped out from the darkness of the vault. He was not wearing a mask. His face was a road map of scars, glowing with implanted circuitry. "Ambush!" Orin roared, opening fire. The chaos was instant. Plasma bolts scorched the air. The Null Choir soldiers moved with synchronized perfection, a hive mind of violence. "Secure the air," Sable commanded. They didn't shoot at Isolde. They swarmed her. Gravity Net's heavy webs of energy shot out, wrapping around her limbs. "Luther!" Isolde screamed, slashing through the first net, but 3 more took its place. Luther raised his weapon, but a sonic pulse hit him from the side, throwing him 20 feet through the air. He slammed into the stone wall, his vision graying out. He watched helpless as they dragged Isolde toward the dark throat of the vault. She wasn't fighting to escape. She was fighting to reach him. "Do not let them take the rhythm," she shouted. Then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Retreat into the vault," Calder ordered his men, firing wildly. "We must cut them off." Luther pulled himself up. His head was bleeding. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, dislocated. He didn't retreat. He didn't wait for Orin. He ran. He ran straight into the darkness where they had taken her. The interior of the storm vault was a labyrinth of sound. There were no lights, only the bioluminescence of the moss that grew on the damp walls. The architecture was organic, like the inside of a giant ear. The wind howled through hidden vents, creating chords that vibrated the bones. Luther ran. He popped his shoulder back into place with a scream of pain that was lost in the ambient noise. He tracked them by the trail of disrupted dust and the faint, lingering glow of Isolde's distress. He turned a corner and skidded to a halt. He was in a circular chamber lined with mirrors. But they weren't glass. They were sheets of polished liquid mercury held vertical by containment fields. The Echo Room. "Welcome, Luther," Sable's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Let us see what you are made of." The mirrors rippled. Luther looked at his reflection, but it wasn't him. In the mirror, he saw a younger man, a man in a white sterile suit lying on a table. He wasn't on a battlefield. He was in a lab. There were no medals on his chest. There were wires. "Subject 7, a voice in the mirror said. "Synaptic integration at 90%. Prepare for memory implant. Scenario veteran. Cinder Prime campaign." Luther staggered back, clutching his head. "No, that is not real. I was there. I remember the mud. I remember the smell." He looked at another mirror. He saw himself standing over a dead Cathari soldier, holding a smoking gun. But he wasn't crying. He was taking notes. "Test successful," the mirror. Luther said, cold, clinical. "Combat reflexes are optimal." "Lies!" Luther screamed. He fired his weapon at the mirror. The bolt passed through the liquid, disrupting the image, but not destroying it. "Is it?" Sable's voice purred. "You feel it, don't you? The gaps, the seams where the pieces don't fit. You are not a hero, Luther. You are a suit of clothes sewn together from other men's nightmares." Luther fell to his knees. The doubt was a physical weight. It crushed him. If his memories were fake, then his pain was fake. His redemption was fake. Then he heard it. Not a memory. A sound in the present. A scream of pure, unadulterated fury. "Get your hands off me, Isolde." The sound anchored him. The implanted memories might be fake, but the voice was real. The woman who had saved him on the bridge was real. I don't care who built me, Luther whispered, forcing himself to stand. I choose who I fight for. He smashed the control panel of the door with the butt of his rifle. The door hissed open. He burst into the central node. It was a cavernous space dominated by a massive crystal spire that pulsed with the heartbeat of the planet. Isolde was chained to the spire by bands of energy. Her tail was clamped into a receiver. Sable stood at a console, his hands conducting an invisible orchestra. The frequency is almost perfect, Sable said. We just need the catalyst. The air's biorhythm will unlock the core. Isolde was thrashing her agony visible as the machine forced her resonance to sync with the dark, discordant song of the Null Choir. Stop it, Luther roared. He raised his rifle, but he couldn't shoot. Sable was behind a shield, and a stray shot could hit the crystal and kill them all. Ah, the Groom, Sable turned smiling. You are just in time to witness the wedding. The union of order and chaos, the machine hummed louder. Isolde screamed, her back arching. The rings on her tail were burning white-hot. She cannot hold it, Luther realized. It will burn her nervous system out. He couldn't stop the machine. He couldn't kill Sable. He had to break the connection. He holstered his weapon and sprinted toward the spire. Don't be a fool, Sable laughed. The energy field will vaporize you. Luther didn't stop. He dove under the main containment beam. He slid across the floor, skidding to a halt at the base of the spire, right next to where Isolde's tail was clamped. Isolde! Luther yelled over the roar of the machine. She looked down at him. Her eyes were bleeding purple tears. She was fading. Luther, she whispered. Run. Not today, Luther said. He looked at the clamp. It was a resonant lock just like the one in the archive. It was fed by her fear, her pain. It was locked by her resistance. To open it, he had to confuse it. He had to introduce a new signal. A signal that contradicted the fear. He reached out with both hands. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed her tail right above the clamp, his palms pressing against the burning oath rings. The shock was immediate and blinding. It was 10 times worse than on the bridge. It felt like sticking his hands into a fusion reactor. Luther screamed, his body seizing up. The neural feedback slammed into his brain, not memories this time, but raw emotion. He felt her terror. He felt her shame at being captured. He felt the crushing weight of her duty. And he pushed back. He pushed his own feelings into the loop. I am here. I am not leaving. I caught you once, I will catch you again. The machine screamed. It couldn't process the dual signal. It was looking for a victim, and it found a partnership. The dissonance shattered the lock's logic. Crack. The clamp exploded. Isolde fell forward, released from the spire. Luther caught her the momentum, knocking them both to the floor. The feedback loop broke. The machine wound down, confusingly silent. Sable stared at them from his platform, his composure finally cracking. Impossible. A human nervous system cannot sustain that connection. You should be dead. Luther lay on the cold stone, his hands smoking his nerves, feeling like they were on fire. He looked up at Sable. I told you, Luther wheezed, grinning through grit and blood. I am really good at fixing broken things. Orin and the rest of the guard burst into the room, firing at Sable's position. The High Cantor cursed and retreated into the shadows, abandoning the control node. The room fell quiet, save for the hum of the crystal spire. Isolde lay across Luther's lap. She wasn't moving. Isolde, Luther shook her gently. Hey, wake up. I didn't get burned for nothing, she gasped, her eyes flying open. She scrambled off him, backing away, until she hit the base of the spire. Her chest was heaving. Her tail was twitching violently, the rings flashing chaotic colors. She looked at her tail. Then she looked at Luther's hands. His palms were blistered, the skin red and raw. You, she hissed. You touched it again. I had to, Luther said, holding his hands up defensively. The lock was bio-coded. I had to short-circuit the— "You took the oath," Isolde shouted, her voice breaking. "Do you have any idea what you did? You didn't just break the lock. You forced a bond. You went inside my head, Luther. You saw everything." She was shaking. She looked violated, terrified. For a Cathari, the tail was the soul's interface. He had forced his way in to save her. "I know," Luther said softly. "I felt it. You are scared you are just a symbol. You are scared you are weak." Isolde turned away, hiding her face. "Go away." "No," Luther said. He struggled to stand up, ignoring the pain in his body. "I saw the fear, Isolde. But you know what else I saw? I saw why you fight. You don't fight for the throne. You fight because you love them. You love the people who forget you." He took a step closer. "I am a fake Isolde. Sable showed me. My memories might be implanted. I might be a weapon grown in a jar. I don't know who I am." He held out his burnt hands. "But when I touched you, that was real. The pain was real. The choice was real. I am not leaving you." Isolde turned back to him. She looked at his hands, hands that were damaged because he refused to let go. She looked at his eyes. There was no deception there, no hunger for power, just a tired, battered man who kept choosing the hard way. Slowly, very slowly, Isolde uncoiled her tail. She didn't lash out. She didn't hide it. She stepped forward. She turned slightly, and with a deliberate, graceful movement, she laid the tip of her tail, the most sensitive, vulnerable part of her anatomy, into Luther's open, blistered hand. The rings glowed. Not red with warning. Not white with pain. They glowed a soft, steady gold. The color of sunrise. "You did not ask permission," Isolde whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "I didn't have time," Luther said, his voice thick with emotion. Isolde looked up at him, tears standing in her amber eyes. "Then this time," she said, closing her hand over his, pressing his palm against her rings, "I allow it. I choose you, Luther. Whatever you are, whatever you were built to be." Luther let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 20 years. "Thank you." Behind them, the massive crystal spire began to hum. It wasn't the discordant noise of the null choir. It was a pure, deep note. The door to the inner core of the storm vault groaned open. "The music is starting," Luther said, looking at the dark passage ahead. Isolde didn't let go of his hand. "Then let us go change the tune," she said. They walked toward the core, leaving the safety of the silence behind, stepping into the music that would decide the fate of the Reach. And for the first time, Luther didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man who had finally found something solid enough to hold on to. The inner sanctum of the storm vault was not a room designed for the living. It was a resonating chamber for the dead. The space was vast, shaped like the inside of a massive inverted bell. The walls were lined with millions of hexagonal pillars, each one glowing with the trapped light of a memory. The air here was so thick with static electricity that every movement created a trail of blue sparks. In the center, suspended over a pit of roiling liquid gravity, hung the core, a complex arrangement of floating crystalline rings that rotated in silence. But it was not silent now. High Cantor Sable stood on a floating platform near the core. He was not wearing armor. He was wearing a conductive suit woven from silver nerves. His hands moved through the air like a conductor, leading a phantom orchestra. "Do you hear it?" Sable asked. His voice did not echo. It was amplified by the room coming from everywhere at once. The history of the Eidolon Reach. It is a cacophony, screams, wars, betrayals. It is noise. Luther, Isolde, Oren. Dr. Mira and Juniper stood at the entrance. They were battered, bleeding, and out of breath. "We are here to pull the plug, Sable," Luther shouted, raising his rifle. "You are here to add a final note," Sable corrected. He flicked his wrist. The storm vault groaned. A wave of invisible energy, pure weaponized nostalgia washed over them. It didn't hit Luther. It hit the others. Orin, the giant who had faced tank fire without flinching, suddenly dropped his weapon. His eyes went wide, filling with tears. "I cannot hold the line," Orin whispered, his voice trembling like a child's. "The flank is gone. My brother is gone. It is my fault." He fell to his knees, clutching at his chest, lost in a memory of a failure from 30 years ago. Dr. Mira gasped, dropping her medical kit. She stared at her hands, which were suddenly shaking. "I lost the pulse," she stammered. "There is too much blood. I am a fraud. I cannot save them." She backed away, her back hitting the wall, paralyzed by the ghost of every patient she had ever lost. "He is playing them," Luther realized, horror dawning on him. "He is using the vault to amplify their worst memories." Isolde was fighting it. Her tail lashed violently, the rings flashing erratic patterns. She pressed her hands to her helmet. "Get out of my head," she screamed. "The Cathari are so proud," Sable mused, adjusting a dial on his floating console. "But your pride is just fear wearing a mask. You fear you are nothing without your storms." Isolde stumbled, one knee hitting the ground. The amber light in her eyes began to dim. Luther stood alone. The memory wave washed over him, but it felt flat. It was like watching a movie he had seen 1,000 times, but didn't care about. The guilt of the war, the faces of the dead, they were there, but they didn't bite like they did for the others. "Why isn't it working on you?" Sable frowned, looking down at Luther. "You should be weeping for your lost squad veteran." "Maybe I just have better coping mechanisms," Luther snarled. But deep down, a cold sliver of ice pierced his gut. Why doesn't it hurt? He pushed the thought away. He had to save his team. He couldn't fight the memories with bullets. He had to fight them with reality. He sprinted toward Orin. The giant was curled into a ball, sobbing. "Orin!" Luther shouted, grabbing the Cathari by the shoulder plates. "Look at me. They are dead," Orin wept. "All dead." "That was 30 years ago," Luther yelled. "Listen to me. You are Orin of the High Guard. You owe me 50 credits for that game of cards we played on the skiff. You hate losing money." It was a stupid, trivial detail, but it was real. It was now. Orin blinked. The crushing weight of the past faltered against the absurdity of a gambling debt. 50 credits, and you snore," Luther added desperately. "Like a broken compressor. It is annoying. Wake up." Orin shook his head, the amber light returning to his eyes. He looked at Luther, then at Sable. The grief hardened into rage. "I do not snore." "Good enough," Luther said. He turned to Dr. Mira. She was hyperventilating. "Mira," Luther slid next to her. "Doctor, I have a patient with a dislocated ego. I need a consult." "I can't," Mira gasped. "You drink your coffee with 3 sugars and you judge people who drink tea," Luther said, gripping her arm. "You are the most judgmental person I know. Judge him." He pointed at Sable. Mira blinked, the fog clearing. She looked at Sable, then back at Luther. "He is very dramatic," she whispered, her breathing stabilizing. "And his posture is terrible." "That is the spirit," Luther said. He turned to Isolde. She was standing up, but she was shaking. She wasn't fighting a memory of failure. She was fighting the crushing weight of expectation. "Isolde," Luther said softly. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the core. "If I stop it," she whispered, "the echo tide stops. The Cathari lose our power. We become just people." "And what is wrong with just being people?" Luther asked. "Kings do not survive being people," she said. "Then be a survivor instead of a king," Luther said. "We don't need a symbol. We need a scout. We need someone who knows the way." Isolde looked at him. The fear was still there, but the paralysis was gone. She nodded. "Impressive," Sable said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "You anchor them. You are a walking gravity well of the mundane. But you cannot anchor a planet. Sable raised both hands. The core spun faster. The hum deepened into a roar. The final concord begins now. Total synchronization. Above them, through the open throat of the vault, the sky turned a solid, terrifying white. The echo tide was not just weather anymore. It was a broadcast signal. "He is locking the frequency," Juniper shouted from the console she had hacked into. "He is using the null choir network to relay the signal from here to every mind in the Reach. In 10 minutes, free will become a legacy format." "Can you cut the line?" Luther yelled. "The dampener is on the other side of the chamber." Juniper pointed to a node on the far wall, exposed and crackling with lethal energy. "If I cross that field, the resonance will boil my blood." "Then we find another way," Luther said. "There is no other way." Juniper looked at the node. She looked at the null choir soldiers who were pouring into the room from the shadows. She looked at her hands, hands that had served a lie for so long. "I am not going back," Juniper whispered. "I am not going back to the silence." She didn't run away. She ran toward the node. "Juniper, no!" Dr. Mira screamed. Juniper didn't stop. She sprinted through the crossfire. A plasma bolt clipped her shoulder, spinning her around, but she kept moving. She reached the dampener node. "Hey, Sable!" Juniper shouted, blood running down her chin. "Here is my resignation." She jammed her cybernetic arm, the null choir had given her, directly into the energy stream. The backlash was blinding. Juniper screamed a sound of pure agony as the energy surged through her metal arm and into the node. But she didn't let go. She held on, acting as a living short-circuit. Crack. The dampener node exploded. The protective field around the core flickered and died. Juniper was thrown backward, landing in a heap of smoking cloth and metal. Dr. Mira was running to her before the body even hit the ground. "The field is down!" Orin roared, opening fire on the null choir soldiers with renewed fury. "For the pilot! Go!" Isolde grabbed Luther's arm. "To the core. We have to manually reset the rhythm before the backup generators kick in." Luther and Isolde sprinted across the bridge toward the central rings. Sable stood in their way, floating on his platform, his face twisted in a snarl. "You cannot stop the song," Sable shouted. He unleashed a wave of sonic force. Isolde slid under the blast, using her tail to vault over the railing and land on Sable's platform. She kicked him in the chest, sending him crashing into his own console. "I hate your music," Isolde spat. Luther reached the central interface. It was a massive, glowing sphere of shifting panels. It didn't have a keyboard. It had 2 handprints, one large, one small, and a receiver for a Cathari tail. "It requires a dual input," Isolde said, scrambling to the other side. "Biometric and resonant. It was designed for the first patriarch and his witness." "You are the patriarch now," Luther said. "Who is the witness?" "You are," Isolde said. "You are the groom." "I thought that was a joke," Luther said, his hands hovering over the interface. "It stopped being a joke when you came back for me," Isolde said. She slammed her hand onto the panel. At the same time, she whipped her tail around, locking the tip into the receiver. "Luther now!" Luther placed his hand on the panel. The connection was instant. It wasn't just pain this time. It was total immersion. Luther felt Isolde's heartbeat as if it were his own. He felt the cold rage of her ancestors. He felt the terrifying loneliness of being the heir. And she felt him. She felt emptiness. She gasped, her eyes widening. Through the link she searched for his childhood, his mother, his home. She found only static. Gray, fuzzy static where a life should be. Luther. Her voice echoed in his mind. "Where are you? I am right here," Luther thought back, gritting his teeth against the intrusion. "Focus on the rhythm. Ignore the ghosts." "You are trying to harmonize chaos," Sable screamed, pulling himself up. "Love is a biological error. It is just a chemical conduit for reproduction. It is weak." Luther kept his hand on the panel, sweat pouring down his face. The energy arcing through him felt like it was cooking his veins. "Yeah," Luther gritted out, looking at Sable. "Well, this conduit is running 50,000 volts. Touch it and see what happens." "Sync with me," Isolde commanded. "Match my pulse, 120 beats per minute. Now." Luther closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about the war. He stopped thinking about the static in his head. He thought about the bridge, the moment he caught her, the weight of her life in his hands. Thump, 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 thump. His heart hammered against his ribs. Thump, thump. On the display, the two waveforms 1, violet 1, blue began to merge. Thump, thump. "The frequency is inverting," Sable shrieked. "No, you will tear the vault apart." "Good," Luther and Isolde said in unison. They pushed. They didn't push a button. They pushed their wills into the machine. They demanded the storm to settle. They demanded the silence to break. The core screamed. A beam of pure white light shot up from the rings, punching through the roof of the cavern, through the rock, and up into the sky. Outside in the desert, the violet clouds were blasted apart. The inverted rain of sand collapsed. The gravity stabilized with a thunderous boom that shook the entire planet. In the vault, the null choir soldiers froze. The hive mind signal that drove them was gone. They looked around, confused weapons lowering. The final concord had shattered into a million individual discordant thoughts. Sable fell to his knees. His life's work, the great silencing, was over. The machine wound down. The hum faded to a gentle vibration. Luther pulled his hand away. He fell backward, gasping for air, his arm numb to the shoulder. Isolde slumped against the console, her tail uncoiling slowly. She looked exhausted, but alive. "We did it," she whispered. "The tide is stable." Sable was laughing. It was a low, broken sound. He was sitting on the edge of the platform, blood dripping from his nose. He looked at Luther with a malice that was colder than the void. "You stopped the storm," Sable wheezed. "Congratulations. But you cannot stop the truth." He reached into his robe and pulled out a small data crystal. It wasn't a weapon. It was a black, jagged shard. "I told you I would show you what you are made of," Sable said. He jammed the shard into the emergency port of his wrecked console. "Don't listen to him," Isolde shouted, trying to stand. But a hologram flickered to life in the center of the room. It was huge, grainy, and undeniably real. It showed a laboratory, a sterile white room with the logo of the Null Choir on the wall. In the center of the room was a growth tank. Inside, the tank floated a man. He looked exactly like Luther. But he wasn't 40 years old. He was fully grown, but his skin was smooth, unscarred. A timestamp in the corner of the hologram read, Cycle 94. Location Biolab Zeta. That was 5 years ago. A voice. Sable's voice from 5 years ago narrated the log. Subject, Anchor Grown Unit 7. Designation the key. Implantation of false memory engrams successful. The subject believes he is a veteran of the Cinder Prime conflict. He believes he is tired. He believes he is seeking redemption. These traits will make him irresistible to the Cathari psychological profile. He is designed to infiltrate. He is designed to be the Groom. The hologram shifted. It showed Luther Unit 7 being woken up. It showed him being dumped in the desert with a bag of tools and a head full of fake nightmares. The hologram flickered and died. Silence. Absolute crushing silence filled the storm vault. Luther stared at the empty space where the hologram had been. He looked at his hands, the scars, the calluses. 5 years, Luther whispered. I remember 20 years of war. I remember the mud. Synthesized, Sable said, smiling through his bloody teeth. We wrote the war, Luther. We wrote the pain. Because we needed a weapon that the Cathari would trust. A broken man for a broken people. Sable leaned forward. You are not a person, Luther. You are a biological lockpick. You were grown in a tube to open this door. Your mother, a petri dish. Your father, me. Luther couldn't breathe. The world was spinning. The static in his head, the gaps he had felt, the lack of childhood memories, it all made sense. It wasn't trauma. It was lack of data. He wasn't a survivor. He was a prop. No, Luther gasped, backing away. No. Kill him, Sable ordered the confused soldiers. He has served his purpose. But before anyone could move, the heavy blast doors at the entrance blew inward. Secure the room, Patriarch Calder strode in, flanked by 50 High Guard elites. They swarmed the room, disarming the dazed Null Choir soldiers. Calder marched up to the platform. He didn't look at Sable. He looked at Luther. And in Calder's eyes, Luther saw the final confirmation. He didn't see surprise. He saw guilt. You knew, Luther whispered, his voice cracking. Calder stopped. The massive warlord looked at the broken man before him. He lowered his weapon. I suspected, Calder said, his voice deep and sorrowful. When you grabbed the tail, the resonance was too perfect. No natural human matches a Cathari biorhythm that well. Only something designed. And you let it happen, Luther screamed. You let me marry her. You let me play house. I wanted to give you a chance, Calder roared back, his composure breaking. I saw a man who didn't know he was a weapon. I thought if I gave you a family, if I gave you a title, maybe the man would overtake the machine. I tried to save you from the truth. Luther. You used me, Luther said, his voice hollow. Just like them. I used you to save my daughter, Calder said. And you did. You did exactly what you were designed to do. But you did it with a heart I did not think you had. Luther looked at Isolde. She was standing by the console. She had heard everything. She looked at him, at the Unit 7, who stood in the body of the man she loved. Luther took a step back. Don't, he said, holding up a hand. Don't look at me. I am not real. He turned to leave. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't be the groom. He was just a piece of wetware that had malfunctioned. Where are you going? Isolde's voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the room. I don't know, Luther said. To the scrapyard. That is where broken tools go. Stop, Isolde commanded. Luther kept walking. I said stop, Isolde moved. She didn't use her tail. She didn't use her blade. She grabbed his arm with her hand and spun him around. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. This is beating, she said. It is a pump, Luther said bitterly. Manufactured in Biolab Zeta. And these tears, Isolde reached up and touched his face. Luther hadn't realized he was crying. Are they manufactured? Is the pain in your eyes part of the code? I don't know, Luther shouted. That is the problem. I don't know what is me and what is the program. I know, Isolde said. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look at her. The program was designed to open the door, she said fiercely. That is done. The program is finished. So who is standing here now? Luther stared at her. Nobody. Wrong, Isolde said. The man standing here is the one who jumped into a gravity well to save Orin. The man who talked Juniper back from the ledge. The man who refused to let go of my hand even when it burned him. She grabbed his hand, the one with the burns from the core, and pressed it against her cheek. Sable wrote the backstory, Luther. I don't care. The backstory is just ink. The choices were yours. No algorithm tells you to sacrifice yourself for a giant you find annoying. She is right, Orin rumbled, stepping forward. He looked at Luther with a respect that bordered on reverence. I have served with real men who ran at the first shot. You stayed. That makes you more real than them. Dr. Mira was kneeling beside Juniper, who was conscious and groaning. He is right, Luther, Mira called out. My medical scanner says you are human. You bleed red. You heal slow. That is all that matters. Luther looked around the room. He saw the faces of the people he had fought for. They weren't looking at a robot. They were looking at him. He looked back at Isolde. The amber fire in her eyes was steady. "My father tried to trap you with a title," Isolde whispered. "Sable tried to break you with a truth. I am offering you something else." "What?" Luther asked, his voice barely audible. "A choice," Isolde said. "The door is open. The storm is calm. You can leave. You can go find a new name." She squeezed his hand. "Or you can stay. Not as a groom, not as a key, but as Luther. Just Luther." Luther looked at the open blast doors. The desert outside was quiet. He could walk away. He could disappear. It was what he had been trying to do for 5 years, or as long as he had existed. He looked at the scar on his hand. He looked at Isolde's tail, the rings now glowing a soft, contented gold. He realized something. The memories of the war might be fake, but the memory of catching her tail, that was his. The taste of the gag root stew, his. The feeling of her hand in his. He had 5 years of real life, and that was enough to build a soul on. Luther took a deep breath. It shuddered in his chest. "I think," Luther started, his voice rough. "I think I am too tired to walk that far." Isolde smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the gloomy vault. "Then sit down," she said. Calder cleared his throat loudly. "The marriage contract," the patriarch boomed, trying to regain some semblance of authority, "has a clause for unexpected biological origins. We can amend it. Groom can be redefined as permanent resident with portfolio." "Dad," Isolde warned. "Shut up." "I am just saying," Calder muttered. "We have a feast prepared. It would be a waste of lava eels." Luther laughed. It was a wet, shaky sound, but it was a laugh. "I hate lava eels." "You will learn to love them," Isolde said. "You have a lifetime to acquire the taste." She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a ceremonial kiss. It tasted of dust, ozone, and survival. "Husband," she whispered against his lips. "Wife," Luther replied, testing the word. It felt heavy but solid, like an anchor. From the corner where 2 guards were hauling the handcuffed Sable away, the high cantor looked back. "It is a lie," Sable screamed. "It is all a simulation." Luther didn't even look at him. He was looking at his family. "Maybe," Luther said to the air, "but it is a really good story, and I am writing the ending." He took Isolde's hand, and together they walked out of the vault, out of the dark, and into the first true sunrise the Eidolon Reach had seen in 1,000 years.